The roguelike genre has been something that's had a steady stream of mainstream success within the past decade. The beginning of the 2010s saw many indie developers create titles that really started to spark a newfound interest in the genre. The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, FTL, and Rogue Legacy were just a few of the games that really started to get people interested in roguelikes again. This trend would continue into the mid to late 2010s, with more indie titles such as Darkest Dungeon, Enter the Gungeon, Into the Breach, Dead Cells, and Slay the Spire, expanding upon the foundation set by the previous era, as well as innovating with additional gameplay styles being added to the roguelike formula. By the beginning of the 2020s, major publishers started to catch on to the genre, with the likes of Returnal and Deathloop being released by Sony and Bethesda respectively. These games saw a larger emphasis on the production values, gameplay loops that had progression outside of the roguelite runs themselves, and also a larger emphasis on a narrative. That's not to say that many of these games I initially mentioned didn't have those things to some extent, just that these games had more of an emphasis on those aspects and felt more like roguelike adjacent games rather than staying 100% faithful to the genre's roots. However, between these two relatively distinct takes on the formula exists the game that we're going to be talking about today, Hades. Now, Hades was the fourth game developed by indie studio Supergiant Games. Supergiant were no strangers to the indie gaming scene, releasing what was at the time considered one of the best indie games created, Bastion, as well as two incredibly solid follow-ups with Transistor and Pyre. People knew who Supergiant were, and they definitely had some expectations with their next title, which was actually really interesting because while Supergiant did take a lot of influence from their previous titles, they also made a number of decisions to deviate from what they've already done. While Pyre has more of an out-there fantasy-style setting, has a longer narrative that would require the player to keep coming back to, and would have multiple pathways for the player to choose their own adventure, Hades is an experience that has most of the dialogue is purely optional, with a narrative that is very straightforward, and has play sessions that really only take around 30 minutes or so. Supergiant considered this game being in the same universe as Pyre, but creative director Greg Kasvin ultimately decided to go with the Greek mythological setting, given that it was something he'd always had some interest in. Supergiant went all in on this setting too, from the architecture and enemy design representing what we would normally expect, to the depictions of the gods being mostly naked and conventionally attractive, to even many characters exploring different sexualities, which is something that was occasionally referenced within the Greek mythos. What a great touch with respect to the source material that also puts it in a much more modern context. I love it. There are of course a few things that needed to change in production. Initially, the main character was set to be Theseus in his attempts to escape the ever-changing labyrinth of Minos. However, after seeing a startling lack of information on the Greek god of the dead, Hades, Supergiant decided to shift focus on making the game about Hades' son Zagreus in his attempt to escape his father's clutches. Supergiant approached Epic Games to essentially form a partnership for their new title, offering to release Hades as a timed exclusive on their new storefront, with a release a few months later to Steam. Ah, a timed exclusive to the EGS that doesn't last multiple years, if it even comes to Steam at all. Huh? Just wait for my Kingdom Hearts video to hear more about that one. Hades was officially announced on the 2018 Game Awards with an early access release the same day. Hades saw a full launch on the Epic Games Store in September of 2020 with subsequent releases to Steam, the Nintendo Switch, PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, pretty much anything you can imagine. And holy shit, for a period of time you could not go anywhere online without people talking about how much they love this game. The game sat in the low 90s on Metacritic, has over 200,000 ratings on Steam, leaving it at overwhelmingly positive, and the game won several accolades for Best Indie Title, Best Action Game, Best Voice Acting, and even a few overall Game of the Year awards. I personally experienced this game when it launched on Steam, and let me tell you, there were a couple of sleepless nights with this one. This gave me the same exact addicting high that previous roguelikes such as The Binding of Isaac and Dead Cells gave me, and I could not stop playing. But it's been a few years since I last checked in with this title, so I wanted to revisit the game today to see exactly what got me so addicted in the first place. What were the things that the game did to break away from its contemporaries, and is it still worth playing today? Well, let's talk about Hades. So first up to bat, let's talk about the absolute marvel of a game that Hades is to look at. God, this game's art style kicks ass. The color palette here is incredibly varied across the game's 4 main zones, each providing their own look and feel to the game. The enemy design invokes a ton of classic tropes from the Greek mythos, and they, along with Zagreus, all show off some spectacular looking particle effects during combat sequences. Maybe a little too spectacular in some cases, as while the earlier areas are mostly fine with this, Some of the later zones can actually get a bit visually cluttered and can be rather distracting, which may cause some damage to be taken that could otherwise be avoided. Now when it comes to the character designs, I already talked about the illustrations of each of the gods looking not only faithful to their mythological counterparts, but also how much personality is brought out with each of their renders. The regalness of Zeus, the flirtatious nature of Aphrodite, or the massive edge-filled bottom energy of Thanatos. Everyone's voice acting is absolutely on point too. You have the jovial uncle exchanges with Poseidon, the running joke of short moans of dialogue that is Charon, just don't piss him off, dear god, the manic nervousness of Dusa, one of my personal favorites, and of course the entire performance of Hades. Logan Cunningham shows a surprising amount of range with this role. More often than not, it'll be the booming commands from the throne room, the fatherly retorts that would make Kratos tell him to chill out, or the dismissive banter before the game's final hurdle before the end of a run. But there's also the performances he has where he's trying to hide things in front of others, the regret that he feels for his actions to protect his family, and the acceptance he has nearing the end of the game as he finally starts to embrace Zagreus as his son. It's all really good stuff. Which brings us to the story. Kind of weird that I talked about the end before anything else, but hey, what can you do? So the story of Hades follows Prince of the Underworld Zagreus in his attempts to escape his father's clutches. Aiding in his attempts to escape is the legendary hero Achilles, supplying him with weapon training, the personification of Night, Nyx, who gives Zagreus with the Mirror of Night, more on that in the gameplay section, and also the help of the entire Greek pantheon to provide him with boons on his attempts. And pretty much every Greek god you can think of is here. Zeus, Poseidon, Ares, Athena, Aphrodite, Artemis, Dionysus, Hermes, and eventually Demeter joins when Zagreus first makes it to the surface. Hell, there's even the primordial personification of chaos, which is a really interesting character to see in this mix. As Zagreus goes throughout his runs, he will meet with other classic Greek mythological characters such as Sisyphus, Eurydice, and Patroclus, who all made appearances throughout the game's 4 areas. During the escape attempts, Zagreus travels across numerous regions of the underworld, including Tartarus, Asphodel, Elysium, and the Temple of Styx in order to attempt to escape. Somewhere along the way, Zagreus is slain and floats down the river Styx back to the House of Hades, where he can reconvene with all the characters in the house to learn more about the events going on before giving another run a go. Eventually, Zagreus learns of his mother Persephone's origins and sets out to find her on the surface. Hades, seemingly hiding something, doesn't allow any mention of Persephone's name in the house, even with most of the other side characters alluding to knowing more than they actually can say. Well, through sheer perseverance, Zagreus eventually beats Hades on the surface and finds his mother in a little cottage in Greece. The reunion is very sweet, but also unfortunately short, because he finds that he gets incredibly sick when staying away from the underworld for a period of time, and eventually must return home. Zagreus has many unanswered questions and vows to escape the underworld once again in order to see his mother again. It kinda reminds me of 50 First Dates. Yeah, I made a reference to a mid-2000s Adam Sandler rom-com. Deal with it. So Zagreus continues to escape the underworld, where more and more information is learned from Persephone in each successful run. Initially, she was given to Hades by Zeus, but eventually grew to love Hades nevertheless. The two had a loving marriage and eventually tried to have a child, but due to the fate stating that Hades would never have an heir, their son was stillborn. This traumatic experience caused Persephone to run away and live on her own because she also hated living on Olympus. Their son was eventually revived by Nyx and given the name Zagreus, and Hades covered it all up to deny her existence in order to keep Persephone safe from the Olympians, who may take her absence as a betrayal. Zagreus eventually convinces Persephone to return home with him on the river Styx so they can be the family that he's always wanted. Upon returning home, Persephone resumes her role as queen of the underworld. Her and Hades come up with a plan to keep her whereabouts a secret, and Hades takes a much softer approach to Zagreus and offers him a job to continually break out of his domain to improve security? Yeah, it's really just a reason to make sense that of allowing Zagreus to continue doing his runs, just roll with it. So yeah, that's the story of Hades. Not too complex, but where it shines is everything surrounding the narrative. The writing in this game, for example, is fantastic. There's an absolute ton of dialogue in this game. While a large portion of it is played for laughs, there are some stints of legitimate mystery and a few really touching moments as well. Each character has a very different relationship with Zagreus that comes to light through the continued communication throughout the game. For almost every interaction that Zagreus has in one of his runs, a character typically has something to comment on about it. Hypnos with the last way that Zagreus died, the narrator breaking the fourth wall to mock Zagreus, or the absolute over-the-top heroic monologues that Theseus gives all the time really get a kick out of me. The dialogue does an excellent job of helping these characters each get their own identity and flesh out the world of Hades. Though I will say, I do think that the way the player goes about experiencing this writing can be a little drawn out sometimes. See, there are really only two scenarios where Zagreus has these interactions, between encounters in his runs and when he returns back to the House of Hades. Now during the runs, it's not so bad because these are usually something that are felt in between combat sections and act as a short break. The ones in the House of Hades, though, can be a bit much. 10 different characters have a chance of showing up here, and most of them will typically have something to say to Zagreus, which can lead to a ton of dialogue needing to be listened through, and most of it is pretty much flavor text that, while nice, can be a bit much after a while. That being said, the story of Hades stands at the very top among the roguelike genre. For this game to have an incredibly tightly written narrative with characters that are both memorable and entertaining in a genre that often forgoes such a thing is honestly worth applause in of itself. The way that Hades takes the familial disagreements of the Greek mythos and paints them in a much more modern light while still paying respect to their origins is also spectacular. And all of this is wrapped up in a way that complements the crown jewel of what Hades has to offer, the gameplay. Hades' gameplay is excellent for two reasons. The first of these being what it does to keep itself in line with the roguelike formula. When it comes to what Hades does similarly with other roguelikes, it's very simple. Zagreus will move from room to room, killing a number of enemies with his weapon of choice, collecting rewards along the way to give him boosts to his abilities through the run, before fighting the boss at the end of each of the underworld zones. Each route has the room layouts, enemy variety, and rewards slightly randomized so no two runs ever feel exactly the same. The key formula to what makes games like The Binding of Isaac and Dead Cells is here, and it's just as strong as ever. But I wanted to take a few minutes to go over what I think about what Hades does with that formula and the gameplay loop that we have on display. The challenge that Zagreus has to face is traveling through the 4 regions of the underworld and defeating the bosses of each zone. One of the Fury Sisters in Tartarus, the Bone Hydra in Asphodel, the tag team of Theseus and Asterius in Elysium, and the final showdown with Hades himself after clearing the Temple of Styx. As you do further attempts, you will see slight variations in the boss attacks, but for the most part, you will deal with these bosses in exactly the same way, which can be a bit disappointing for those coming from games such as The Binding of Isaac that has a very large variety of bosses. That being said, there do exist a couple of secret bosses that can provide some extra challenge to players that do seek them out. As the game progressively increases in difficulty, I think you'll find that the common enemies become more of a threat as they are a lot more plentiful and unpredictable than the bosses, especially in later heat levels. Some of the enemies are honestly quite annoying, especially with the ones with armor that you can't stun. Those can be some of the hardest ones to deal with. Some of my least favorite enemies in the game have to be the Medusa heads for being able to stun you if they hit you with their projectiles, the small chariots in Elysium for exploding before you can finish them off, and nearly everything in the Temple of Styx for being able to poison Zagreus. God, these guys are annoying. Now, to contend with these foes, Hades does take some influence from earlier Supergiant games with the isometric viewpoint and hack and slash style of gameplay. Zagreus has his basic attacks, special attacks that vary depending on the weapon choice, a cast to do long range damage, a dash to avoid attacks, and eventually a summon to call down the aid of one of the gods of Olympus. Which brings me to the Olympian boons, probably the most defining feature of a run in Hades. See, each god will occasionally offer Zagreus a boon in order to give him more power in his escape attempts. These are essentially the main building blocks of your build, and some of the most fun things to experiment with in this game. Each god is able to augment any of the previously mentioned abilities for Zagreus, or even provide him with passive buffs. And these aren't the plus however many % bonuses that you might see in other roguelikes, but fundamental changes to your playstyle. I will say I do find some gods a bit more useful than others though. Like, I think Zeus and Poseidon have some of the best room clearing potential in the game with their chain lightning and knockback effects, as well as Hermes being able to provide some passive buffs like automatically dodging or getting extra money per room. I also especially like Chaos for offering a risk reward style of play. Most of the other gods are pretty build specific. I don't think any of them are necessarily bad, with maybe Aphrodite being on the lower side of things in my opinion, but I still find nearly every god useful in some way. Some boons even require prerequisites in order to get the legendary or duo variants. These could be some very powerful combinations that do take some planning to get, but are almost always worth considering. The other thing affecting your playstyle during your runs are the Daedalus hammers. You'll typically get around 2 of these per run, but these will augment Zagreus' weapons in a big way. I think these are always worth going after, as some of them will fundamentally change how the weapons will actually work. I personally really like the ones that increase my attack speed or cause my special to go off twice, since stacking these with certain boons can essentially double the damage from that one attack. There exist pickups such as coins to spend on Charon's shops, pomegranates to increase the level of your current boons, center hearts to increase your max health, as well as currencies such as chthonic keys, darkness, gemstones, and nectar that act as room rewards, and the Titan blood, diamonds, and ambrosia from boss rooms. These each have their own use that comes with the second main reason why Hades gameplay is so excellent, what the game does to stray away from the roguelike formula. Hades might be one of the least roguelikes that I've ever played in my life, which I didn't mind, but I know it could definitely bother some people. Hades is a game that has a story that wants you to experience the full thing, which asks the player to clear clear the game a grand total of 10 times. Now, anyone who steps foot in their first run of Hades might be scratching their head as to how any of that could even be possible, as very few people can even make it past the first boss of Hades on a fresh save, let alone the entire game. So what Hades does is a couple of things to make it easier for the player on subsequent runs. The main thing that Hades does is allow players to apply passive buffs for later runs that can fundamentally change their playstyle and improve what they're already good at. This comes with all the previously mentioned currency. You have the Chthonic keys that unlock new weapons, a total of 6 with 4 variants each that each play very differently from one another, and new items to spend other currencies on. Darkness to unlock buffs in the mirror in Zagreus' room, gemstones to add new room types to the underworld and cosmetic items in the house, and the nectar to get trinkets that can be switched out for further bonuses in your runs. The nectar can also be used to progress quest lines for each of the NPCs to get pets to assist you in battle, but I didn't really go after these because I honestly felt like maxing out each of the characters' affinity was just a bit too much of a time waster. As for the boss items, the Titan Blood allows the purchase of different aspects of Zagreus' weapons, as well as upgrading what he already has. The diamonds are used for further purchases in the house contractor, but are mainly used for more room rewards and music. And the ambrosia is used for furthering the progression in character-specific quest lines and upgrading your summons, so you'll probably be sitting on a lot of these by the first time the credits roll. The other one of these game decisions to help players see the entire story through is called God Mode, a difficulty option that makes the player more powerful with every death. I did not try this option personally. It's great that something like this exists in order to allow more people to experience the narrative that Hades wants to tell. On the flip side, after your first clear, you unlock something called the Pact of Punishment, which essentially allows the player to apply difficulty modifiers so that they can get more loot from the boss encounters. I am honestly a little conflicted about how this was implemented. On one hand, the flexibility you get to increase the difficulty to your liking is an awesome addition, and one that I think more roguelikes should implement. These include your standard things like taking extra damage from particular sources and getting through an area under a time limit, but they also add some more interesting things such as giving additional abilities to enemies and bosses, as well as other fun things that really do freshen up the experience. You can apply as many of these modifiers as you want in any combination, and going through a run with these modifiers equips you with even more boss drops. Now, what I don't think works with this. The entire point of Hades is to get 10 successful runs, which as a player you will more than likely be looking towards how to make these runs as easy as possible. So applying modifiers that really only exist to give the player more of a challenging time is a bit counterproductive to this whole system. As it is, the only real reason to up the heat levels is to get more boss drops, which if I'm being honest, outside of getting additional weapon aspects and some better room rewards, I thought were not necessary in the slightest. In fact, after clearing the story of Hades, the main thing to do is to really just grind out NPC quests and upgrading things with boss items, which is a grind that didn't really hold my interest for very long. Don't get me wrong, this system is fun and it gives people a little bit more depth to the progression, but other than that, I think it's a pretty skippable feature. Keep in mind, this is a feature that you will more than likely first encounter 75% of the way through the game, around the 15 to 16 hour mark. It has no real bearing on the enjoyment of the game as it's completely optional. For many, that's enough to keep players cranking up the heat level, which if anything really goes to show how good Hades' central gameplay loop is to keep players engaged past the 50-hour point when looking for total completion. Hades is a remarkable game, and a landmark title for not just the roguelike genre, but for indie games in general. The game has an absolutely stellar presentation with superb voice acting, a kick-ass soundtrack, and a stellar art style that still gives this game a unique sense of identity. The story is touching, incredibly well written, is respectful to the source material, and it plays off the tropes of the genre incredibly well. The gameplay is addictive, deep, highly customizable, and is an absolute joy to experience. While I do think there is some visual clutter, the dialogue can be a bit long-winded at times, and some minor features don't pan out 100% perfectly, this game still gets a very high recommendation from me. It truly stands out as not just one of my favorite roguelikes, but one of my favorite games of all time. But that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for watching. What were your favorite memories of Hades? Please be sure to leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you guys again, and I'll catch you in the next video.